Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. There is a new series which I recently started, Cold War, Living Under Its Shadow. And the stories that individuals have about their personal experiences being part of the Cold War. All of us were part of the Cold War, but we were impacted on a different level. So today, I'm very honored to have someone that I call a friend, a guest, someone who is an author, a writer, but a very sensitive human being. I found that for the many shows we've done and all the talking we've done in the background. Raul Ramos y Sanchez. He's an author of the Class H trilogy, America Libre, House Divided, and Pancho Land. And I am very honored to have all three books in my collection. Thank you. Thank you for that. Raul, thank you for sharing your story, your personal story. Let me give you a little bit of, provide a little bit of background. You left Havana, Cuba, when you were 6 years old, and your
Yes.
mom, brought you to the U.S. You went to New York, and then you went to Florida. That's as far as I'm going to go because the rest of the story is totally yours. Right smack pre Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs, April 17th to the 20th in 1961. So you were caught in that also as well as you were growing up. So, but let's take you back first and foremost. Why did your family, your mom, leave Cuba?
Well, my dad was involved in the resistance, and there were a lot of different resistance movements at that time. It had not consolidated. My dad was associated with one in Havana. It was primarily students, but the others that were involved in it. And he was doing things that my mom thought were very dangerous. And so he was afraid for herself, for me. And so she decided to leave. And she eventually wound up divorcing my father. But at that time, she left and we went to New York City at the age of 6. It's when that I started the first grade in New York. When summer came that year, my mom decided that I should go back and see my father and her family as well. So I went back to Cuba by myself on a plane. I was picked up by my relatives there. And so I spent that summer in Havana and then came back to the States. By that time, my mom had moved to Miami. And so we wound up doing the same thing for the next 5 years through 1956 through 1961. And it was a pretty unique perspective because those years spanned the time before the success of the Castro Revolution and then afterwards. That happened in New Year's of 1959. And so I was there in the summer of 59 and in the summer of 60. I was not there when all the turmoil was taking place, when the trucks rolled into Havana. I was not there for that, but I was there immediately afterwards. And of course, a lot of my mom's relatives were as well as my dad. And so they were happy with the outcome. Unlike a lot of Cuban exiles who came immediately after Castro took over, they had their reasons for wanting to leave, and I certainly respect and understand those. And my family did not. And so I kept, my mom kept sending me back for the next couple of years until finally in 1961, when things got really, really hot during the Cold War, my father decided I was not going to go back. And so my mother went back and got me out. And that was the last time, November of 1961, that I was ever in Cuba until 2013, when I went back for the first time in 52 years. But the Cold War piece of this, I think, is what, this show is about. And I think I had the unique opportunity to witness the Cold War from both sides, from the US side and from the side of a nation that was aligned with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And I got to see that perspective both before and after.
Go more in depth in that particular statement. Take me back to one of your summer periods that you were there. Did you end up in Havana and just live 2 months, sort of like happy-go-lucky kid walking around the city? Or were there already tensions, political tensions that you saw or you sensed even as a child that you sort of had to keep adapting to?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Armando, because I remember there was a time when I was with my father. This was before the revolution, and my father had a business which was ideal for helping the cause of the revolution. He and his brother-in-law, my mom's brother, had a tire business, and they traveled all over the island, selling tires, exchanging tires. They would be carrying them in this big truck loaded down with tires. Underneath the tires were supplies that or whatever was needed in the mountains. It might be ammunition, it might be medicine, it might be food. And he was part of an underground ferrying system that would take supplies back and forth across the island. And that was, I learned about this later. At the time, I was never told what was going on. But I do remember one particular incident where my dad and I were in his truck, and it was just the two of us, and he saw a roadblock up ahead. And all of a sudden, he pulled that truck off the road, and we were going like 50 miles an hour down a dirt path because my father obviously did not want to get caught in that roadblock. And I remember bouncing in the truck, my head hitting the roof, and I'm wondering, Dad, why are we doing this? And it turned out we didn't want to get the truck inspected. So we must have been carrying something he was really worried about them searching the truck for.
Did this happen at other times as well? Did you find other experiences like that where you sort of walked into things and you thought, I shouldn't be here?
That was the one that comes to mind. Most of the time I was kept pretty much in the dark about what was going on. And it was only later, after the revolution succeeded, that I was told what was going on the whole time. And my mom knew nothing of this. I doubt she would have sent me back if she knew how harrowing this stuff was that I was getting involved in. Even peripherally, because I don't think my dad would ever put me in danger of anything like that. But this just happened to be one day where I was there and I experienced it firsthand.
So you were living the Cold War in a whole different way. You're with the possibly gun running episode.
Yes, that part was something that I was not aware of. But after the revolution is when I really had the experience of seeing both sides of the Cold War. And of course, in Miami, my neighborhood had Cuban exiles in it. It had, Anglo-Americans who were very anti-Castro, and heard, horror stories. I mean, these are communists. They're out to take over the world. They're hard people. All of the things that you expect to hear. And then I would go back to Cuba and I'd see my family, and they're saying terrible things about the United States. They're greedy. They want to take over the world. It's the imperialist octopus and all these other terrible things. And I'm thinking, no, that's not who I live with. Those are friends and my, people, my neighbors. So I realized that, in the Cold War, in those kind of environments, people exaggerate. They look for the worst, and then they always believe they're the good guys. We're the good guys. So that was probably the biggest takeaway for me in experiencing that on both sides, was that, both sides have decent, good people that think they're doing the right thing, and the other sides are the bad guys. And it was a thing that stuck with me ever since. I think it's informed a lot of the work that I've done, and even my attitude towards, the world in general.
Sort of moving forward with an interpretation that you don't take things at first face value. You sort of try to look at it from different points of view.
Absolutely. I mean, it's in the interest of those in power to gain support. It's also very useful for somebody who is a dictator to have somebody to blame their problems on, right? It's a thing. So I think that leaders use nationalism, they use fear, they use hatred to enhance their own power. And that's nothing new. I mean, many leaders throughout history have done that, of every ideology, in every continent, all over the world. It's not a new story. I just lived it firsthand.
A point of interest that I caught in something you said. There was a point when your father said, "No, I want you to stay here," and your mom went back to Havana to get you out.
Yes.
How did she manage?
That's exactly right.
To do it?
Well, that was a great deal of subterfuge as well involved in that. My dad, because of this tension that was growing, he did not want me to go back to the States again. He felt like if I left, I would never go back. Well, he was right. It turns out he was right. But when my mom got wind of that, then she goes back to Cuba and then puts on this big show. Oh no, I'm embracing the revolution. I'm here repatriating and so forth and so on. And so in the meantime, she was working immediately to try and get me out. And so what she arranged with the help of her father was that we bought round trip tickets to Madrid because flights going anywhere out of the country at that time were at a premium. And so my grandfather actually slipped a little money to somebody to get us a seat. And it turned out Madrid was the only place that they had a seat available to. It was very expensive too, because we were going clear across the ocean. And so we bought the tickets round trip, because you had to buy round trip tickets.
Yeah, you were coming back, right?
And then we got off the plane, made a stop in Bermuda. And so my mom got off the plane and told the people there that at the time it was still a British colony. Yes. And my mom said, we want to go back to the United States. We're American residents. We want to go back. And the Brits didn't know what to do with us. So they sent us, we wound up going to Bimini and then finally wound up in Jamaica, all in one night. And then we stayed in a hotel until we could get the whole thing arranged. And then we were finally able to come back to the States after about a month in Jamaica, making sure that we were who we said we were and that we were able to enter the country again. So I spent that time, missed out some school, but finally was able to get back.
What were you thinking all this time?
I was thinking, I was actually glad to get out that time, because in the Cuban school that my dad put me in, it was known that I was Americanito, that they treated me as if I was an American. I spoke Spanish just fine, but because of the animosity towards the United States at that time, I was pretty much in a fight almost every day in school. Somebody was starting up a fight with me almost every day. And so it was a hard time. It was difficult. I probably suffered more for being American in Cuba than I ever suffered being Cuban here in the States. And not that I haven't had my share of difficulties, but it was a tough time. It was a very tough time. And so I was very relieved 50 years later when I got in touch with my family that they were open to my coming back. And in fact, it's been wonderful reconnecting with my relatives again, because the Cold War is over in Cuba. I don't think there's anybody there that wants to go back to that. They're very much put that behind them. They embrace the Cubans that are coming back. And I saw that, I've seen that firsthand. My wife has come back with me. She's from Ohio, and she's been welcomed. My family loves her. In fact, they've told me don't come back without her.
That's a
they
good
love her
dearly. Otherwise, don't show up.
And even my siblings born here, my mom remarried and she had 2 children, and one of them has gone back and she's been embraced and loved and just adored. So it's so wonderful to see the Cold War end for our family, that's behind us. But at the time, the Cold War was very real, on both sides. Now, while I was experiencing this, animosity towards Americans in Cuba, I went to a mass rally and people were yelling, Cuba sí, Yankees no, Cuba sí, Yankees no. And there was, they had chants that were demeaning. I think at the time, it was just very, very ugly, and the feeling towards Americans. And so, I experienced that. And then I would go back to Miami, and there we were having duck and cover drills at school. They actually had a map that they showed us in school where they would drop the atomic bomb on Miami to create possible damage or population loss. And our house was in ground zero of so I was like, okay, now I've got the other side of this whole Cold War thing, which is what most American born or alive during that time experienced, which was the fear of nuclear war. And I can remember we lived in a boarding house one night, and a police siren, in the night going by. I thought it was an air raid alarm. And I went through the house knocking on everybody's door, waking them up, telling them there's an air raid,
Oh,
because I was
wow.
having this, nightmare that, we were getting bombed. And I can remember walking outside of our house and seeing the lines of, I was a real military plane buff. So they were C-119 flying boxcars. I remember them vividly flying, just one after another. It's like for 10 minutes, they seemed to be flying overhead, heading south towards Homestead Air Force Base, where they were gathering for the potential invasion there. So, it was a very, very sobering experience to see that, when you see the manifestations of war happening that closely, that, it was very, very sobering. Then I'm going to flip back to Cuba again. My father was a captain in a militia company. And in Cuba, there were militiamen sitting on the street corners at night, on street corners with machine guns in their lap, expecting an invasion. So I go back and I see that. And my father's militia company would train. And so I was kind of like a mascot. They would take me along, and I was with them and they even let me, shoot a Springfield rifle, an M1 carbine, a Czech submachine gun. I got to fire weapons with the Cuban militia. I even had a little uniform with a beret and a little green thing. I mean, so it was an experience of being on both sides of this conflict, which seemed inevitable at that time. And I'm sure everybody who was alive then felt like it was a very real possibility that we were gonna have World War III. And I remember somebody saying, if there's a World War IV, it's going to be with clubs, because there's not going to be a whole lot left after World War III. And so we all grew up with that. It was like somebody said, fallout was in our baby formula practically, that we grew up with the idea of atomic attack. And in those days, I saw it as very, very real.
How did it impact you as you grew up? Those experiences, how did it impact you?
Well,
in your way of thinking, in your writing, and just your development.
It made me very understanding of conflict. That conflict is always between sides that assume that they're the good guys and the other guys are the bad guys. And so it's always made me want to hear the other side's point of view and get to know, because there's probably some common ground if we're really willing to listen. And it's easy to demonize, very, very easy to demonize, and very easy to fall into the trap of hatred and animosity. It takes a lot more courage to listen. It takes a lot more courage to ask and look for the humanity on the other side, because I saw it. I lived it. I mean, I saw my family on one side of this Cold War. I saw my friends and neighbors on the other. And there were no bad guys there. There were no bad guys. There were just people that had been led into a lot of conflict. And I think that's the takeaway for me, is that there's always a way out of every problem if you're willing to resolve it and think it through. But if you let yourself be guided by slogans, if you let yourself be guided by demonization, hatred, then the conflict becomes inevitable. But it isn't. That's what I've taken away from that.
The future is not set in stone. It's still to be built, given the right conditions. Absolutely. To be open to look at the new options and try to find some middle ground.
Yep, it's there. If you're willing to look for it.
This is a very difficult question, one I ask myself, and I haven't come to any substantial answer, but I thought I'd ask, what do you think would have happened in your life had the Cold War not existed?
Well, it's hard to answer that, because I mean, I've lived it. I can't imagine what it would be like without it. It's such an integral part of who I am. And I think it isn't just me. I have to believe that the Cold War is that significant to the baby boom generation as, say, the Depression or even World War II was to our parents' generation. It is such a powerful, fundamental thing. For example, Vietnam became a big issue because of the draft, because of the war resistance movement. If we don't have a Cold War, if we don't have the use of small nations as proxies, as we had in Vietnam, we don't have the Vietnam War, and we have a whole loss of generational upheaval, which I don't think would have ever happened. So again, there's another Cold War relic that we had to live with, we had to deal with. And so that's why I think I really appreciate your series in exploring the impact of the Cold War, because I don't think it's really emphasized enough of what an impact that it's had on all our lives and how it shaped us.
I'm concerned that people think that, as you mentioned, I'll take Vietnam, that was back then, even though it was part of the series of evolution of things and policies that were evolving out of the Cold War. And something so big and so worldwide for so many years, 57 to 91, that we can't, it's in our DNA, I think, especially the baby boomers. We can't get rid of it. On the contrary, we better start going back and embracing it and realize where we are today based off of it, one way or the other. So that's,
well, I mean, Cuban American culture is, as it exists, would not be here if not for the Cold War and the fact that Castro chose to align himself with the Eastern Bloc. There would be no exiles in Miami. There would be no Ted Cruz. There would be no Marco Rubio. There would be no Bob Menendez, 3 Cuban American senators that we have that probably would never have been here had it not been for the Cold War. So it's American politics in ways which, we really can't even begin to grasp, but it's there. I mean, it's a big, big influence.
If I can throw
and even going back to before that, the McCarthy era, I think was also part of the Cold War. All the ostracism of artists, of writers, of creative people that took place because of the Cold War scare and the McCarthy, witch hunt of trying to ferret out communists. Again, that has a deep, deep impact on our culture as well.
I think you bring it to the surface, and I hadn't thought of it that way. The word communism was attached to a lot of things, whether people didn't really know what it was. And as long as somebody heard it, now obviously you bring that to the surface with the McCarthyism, and people heard the word and all of a sudden started running for it. But yet, what is it? Who is it? What, people started pointing at each other because no one really understood what it was. And you brought that to surface. I have a little joke in this dark moment of this history, and I've always said it. And I said, if Castro had been allowed to pitch baseball for the Seattle baseball team, none of this may have happened. Why didn't somebody say, yeah, you know what, you're not a great pitcher, but we're going to let you join the team? It would have solved so many things, It's been a surprise. So it's my own personal.
It's funny. I have a story I tell. A very good friend of mine, he's from Indiana and been a long, long time friend. He came to visit me. At the time I was playing music and I was down in Dallas. And so he came down to visit me on vacation and from Ohio. And so while I was playing music, I had a day job at an artist mall. And so while he came to visit me and have lunch, he wandered upstairs and met this young artist who had a little artist shop on the second floor. And he turns out that just on that, they married. And then they have 2 kids. And so I told his daughters that if not for Fidel Castro, you 2 wouldn't exist. Because I would have never come to the United States. Your dad would have never come to Dallas and met your mom. And so you can thank you're here because of Castro. So, the connections are pretty powerful. So yeah. I always love that story.
Well, I hope we learned our lessons of not ever bringing together a circumstance of apocalypse based on decisions like it did in the missile crisis in Cuba. And also the Bay of Pigs. That was another fiasco to show, that policy is not always clear on what decision making should be made. So you bring in so many issues and side issues, and you know we have to think. We have to think about the dangers of the future. It's not something that
Mhm.
Cold War passed and now we're off to a really wonderful world. We have to think and
Mhm.
learn from it. So Raul, I can't thank you enough for being taking time from your writing and your new books that are coming out. I have a glimmer of what they are, but no mention of it until that secret is released from you, what it is. So
Right.
I want you to
Right.
come back and always feel welcome to talk about your book. And
Thank you.
but thank you for sort of keeping me in the backstage loop on what's going on. You keep up your wonderful work.
I appreciate it, Armando. I think this is a great project, and I'm very happy to take part in it with you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking to Raul Ramos y Sanchez, author. Please look him up. You will find some fantastic work, literary work on the idea. But now we have another level to understand Raul and also our Cuban neighbors, our Cuban families, because we all are related to each other somehow. We've all mixed together. We
Absolutely.
all have the music, our culture. We have more in common than we think we do. So let's not put that aside.
Absolutely.
Let's embrace it as well. Raul, thank you again for being on our program. I look forward to having you again in the very, very near future.
Thank you, Armando.